So, Latrice, are you familiar with the Center for Food Safety?
You know, I've heard of them, but I've never really delved into the nitty-gritty of the organization.
So, we're mostly a public interest law firm, and we work at the intersection of ag and the environment. So, communities will come to us when they're experiencing the impacts of industrial agriculture. And we typically tend to sue the government for failing to do their job and enforce the rules to properly protect communities. Mostly we litigate under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And I've been with the organization since 2013.
Oh, nice.
And most of my work is here. I live in Hawaii, on Kanaka Maoli land, and have worked with a broad section of community stakeholders to try and stop the large agrochemical companies, namely Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta, from spraying pesticides in our communities without any regulation.
That stuff's really important too when it comes to community health. People don't really understand the effects. It's more than going into a grocery store to pick out something you want for dinner. But it's tied to so much more on a global scale.
Totally. Hi, Liz.
Hello. Good to see you, Latrice.
You too, Liz.
As always.
I was just giving her the 411 on the podcast. So I was tasked by our executive director to help produce and host a podcast for the organization. And in thinking about what I would want to listen to on a regular basis, I decided that I felt like stories of activism and resistance were most important in this moment. So our talk today is really about our personal journeys into activism. And of course, we all know that these journeys are also grounded in complex contexts that require some explanation. So I might stop you guys and be like, well, wait, explain that a little bit. I want to know more about that issue or that opportunity. But for the most part, we want to just learn about you and how you got into the work, what keeps you inspired. I'd love to know, maybe we can start with how you guys met. From there, I figure we'll have a lot to talk about. I'm typically a pretty chatty person. So does that sound good?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, cool. So how'd y'all meet? How do you know each other? And where are you, Latrice? Where are you zooming in from?
Well, I'm currently zooming in from the Blackfeet Nation up in Montana. We border the Glacier National Park, which is our ceded territory, as well as the Bob Marshall Wilderness and we call it the Medicine Line, but the Canadian border. We have sister tribes up there. We're the only tribe in the United States. We have 3 other sister tribes in Canada. So I'm coming to you from Montana.
And Liz, remind us, where are you zooming in from?
Yeah, I'm coming from just a few minutes from UC Santa Barbara on Chumash territory in Goleta, California.
How did you guys meet? Just for our listeners, so we reached out to Liz, and Liz was like, we must have Latrice. So Latrice, your reputation precedes you. And I'd love to know how you guys connected and where that begins.
Liz, do you want to tell that story?
Yeah.
It's always interesting.
And you can hear it from Latrice's side, and I'll learn something too. Yeah. Well, I should tell you first. My grandmother lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl, And so she grew up in Western Nebraska. And I always admired this really deep land connection that she had. And also, I was really sobered by the stories that she told of losing that land connection and of seeing the land be degraded, even though, you know, her family meant to care for it and to grow food there. She saw that what they were doing was actually damaging that land. And so that's the kind of seed for me of doing work in you know, regenerative and organic agriculture. So I grew up in Montana. And when I started graduate school, I started hearing about these incredible programs that Blackfeet Community College was offering as a 1994 land grant university. I started learning about what that meant. And people were telling me about Terry Tatsey and these incredible sustainable agriculture programs that he was offering from a tribal perspective, connected to both longstanding cultural traditions of land management and also his background in veterinary science and getting young people excited about, you know, the future of stewarding land in Blackfeet territory. And so I got to have a couple conversations with Terry Tatsey at conferences when I was just starting to learn about sustainable and regenerative agriculture and thinking about, you know, what the future of that might be in my home state, and was just so impressed learning about buffalo restoration and how it was informing the way that Terry and his students were thinking about cattle management. So that sort of planted a seed. And then, gosh, you know, 10 years later, as I was starting to research this book, I was also talking to folks in Montana who, you know, are connected to regenerative agriculture. And people started telling me about Latrice Tatsey. Latrice Tatsey is this incredible leader in buffalo restoration and how that impacts cattle management, how that leads us to think differently about cattle ranching and why it's really important for indigenous communities to lead this work. And she's doing this awesome thesis research at Montana State. And I said to myself, I remember Terry talking about his daughter and how she was the future of all of this work. And so I reached out to Latrice. It was pandemic. So we met on Zoom, just like this. And the book came out, and then eventually we met in person at a book event.
You know, that was it. It was funny how it started, because Liz was leaving voicemails because I was working in the field with interns with part of, like, what I always say is, like, when I started with a research question, it like took off. And so I started to do field work, and so Liz would miss me, and so I finally like got her voicemail, and I was at home, and I was like, I'm gonna call her. And so, like, I was literally like parked a mile away from my house because I don't get cell phone service. And we had this whole conversation. And, you know, I didn't know, like, at the time it was going to turn into a chapter of a book. And, you know, I was so blown away when, you know, we'd have these interviews, and then she'd be like, look at what I wrote. And I was like, wow. And then I seen like the book come out, I was like, wow, you know, this was all done like really virtually and by phone. And you know, so for us, when we finally got to meet, it was like a aha moment of like we could finally hug and, like, you know, have this face to face interaction. So it was really nice in that regard. You know, it was of kind of like knowing how she met my father, and, you know, not really knowing our paths would cross, and them already having like this established relationship of knowing who each other were. And so, you know, then here I come, you know, 10 years down the road. So.
I love it. There's something you said, Latrice, in your sort of intro about the medicine line that I just can't gloss over it. And I want to go back to it because as a white person that has lived as a settler on native lands my whole life, very unconsciously, I always forget that these boundaries we've drawn disconnected native people from where they were always connected. And I wanted to just take that moment for Montana, sitting in the borderlands, and remember that. So thank you for offering that alternative image of the medicine line, and loving that the birth of y'all's relationship is multi-generational and one of shared inquiry. Latrice, tell me a little bit about you. Like, what is this work that had Liz so fascinated that she got to write her beautiful poetic writing about?
For me, the work has gone back to who I am as a person. And my father having a big influence on my life because growing up, my mom was always in college and working to better her future, to provide a better future for me and my siblings. And so my dad had, this, like, he was my babysitter. Like, I cried. I didn't want to go to preschool, so my preschool was like riding on back of a horse. He would be fencing, ranching, riding colts, and would be, he'd be going, checking out buffalo jumps and teepee rings. And, I was just a kid, looking and being like, oh, wow, not really knowing, but, growing up in it. And so for me, it was always a part of who I am. And it's always been a part of my story of like, knowing how connected we are to the land, and knowing that we are not above it or below it, but we are here to nurture and care for it. And so, having that background, it has always stuck with me because I was like, I want to give back to the land, and I want to find ways that I can help manage the land that protects it for future generations. Because, in our view, and, from the Amskapi Pakani, the way we look at it is, we are only the caretakers, and we are the caretakers of the land for the next generation. And so my dad, always talks about growing up with his grandfathers, and his grandfathers were, said, we're building this for the next generation. And, so the decisions that my dad's grandparents were making were benefiting, him as a grandchild, and the decisions my grandma was making was benefiting me as a child, and the decisions my dad's making now on the ranch is benefiting my children. And so it's the environment we grow up in. So when I was going to school, doing my associates at Blackfeet Community College, I was finding research that had the Western and the cultural tie, because growing up, that's how I was taught to think. I was taught to think not only in the world we live in now, but also my culture. And so then I was like, my culture is related, the way we do things, that's tied to that cultural science aspect of who we are as indigenous people, not speaking for all because we don't all have the same methodologies, but understanding our cultures are tied back to the land. And so, that was really important. So, working my way through my associates to my bachelor's, and then to my graduate degree, that part of who I am has really kept me grounded to the work that I wanted to do and the research that I wanted to do, to, this last degree of looking at how, the reintroduction of bison influences the land, and not really influencing, but more so knowing what that relationship is. I guess I should quit saying influences, but really wanting to know what that relationship is, because these animals have evolved. And you think about this evolvement, and what does that have to do from the bottom up or the top down? And so for me, it was really looking at it from the soil aspect of it, and these animals being on the land, and trying to really understand what that relationship is, and utilizing that information I collected to work with ranchers. And the current job that I have now is, how could we utilize our cultural knowledge with bison grazing to mimic that for cattle grazing. So we were being sustainable land managers, but looking at it from the context of, historical perspectives.
Yeah, it's moved me a lot as a activist and a thinker in Hawaii to understand more fully how important animals are to the broader circular ecosystem. I think we've sort of separated animals from agriculture or from crops, and yet it's so integrated. And even in our food safety regulations, trying to move animals off of production is wild. And I've been really inspired by your work and the work of others to help us understand how herding animals have helped maintain the health of soil. So thank you for that. Liz, so you find your way as a researcher to back home, which I also want to honor to your connection to that land. It sounds like you were raised by Montana and Montana raised you. So why did the work of Latrice and her father inspire you and call you home?
I love how you phrase that question. Yeah. Because I do feel a really strong connection to that land. And I feel a lot of gratitude to all the indigenous managers of those lands that have given me so many gifts. And I think have really kind of shown me a path in life. And so, my first kind of inclination that I wanted to pursue something around agriculture professionally. My grandmother having really planted those seeds for me actually came when I went to work for U.S. Senator Jon Tester, who he's still in the Senate. And when he really ran on this platform of a green economy. And he told the story of converting his family's farm to organic. And how he felt like that had really saved their farm economically. And so he talked about how Montana, since settler colonial times had this extractive economy, mining and fossil fuels and extractive agriculture kind of dominating this economic system, but that he felt like the future, both from an economic standpoint as well as an ecological standpoint, was a renewable economy. And so I was very inspired by that. I was 24. I'd been a country singer. I'd heard a lot of stories from rural people about how
we're going to need you to sing before this episode is over. So you outed yourself. But anyway, I digress.
Try to slip that in there. Yeah. But, so I'd heard a lot of tough stories from a lot of rural folks around the country about how the agricultural economy that we have, it's just not working for most farmers and ranchers. And people were struggling to figure out how to stay on their land, how to make anything possible for the next generation. And so when Jon Tester ran and talked about, this renewable economy and that we could be on the land in a way that gave something back and that gave us a promise of a future, that sounded like a balm, for the wounds that I'd been hearing from these rural communities around the country. So I went to work for Jon Tester as a legislative correspondent for agriculture and natural resources. And it was in that job that I started to meet people on the ground in Montana who were, working on solutions and then had ideas for us around policy. And that's when I first started hearing about the work at Blackfeet Community College. And I went to graduate school and I started, just spending more time in Montana and going to people's farms, hearing people's stories. I wrote a book about, the transition to including pulse crops in wheat farms, Lentil Underground, about all these organic farmers who'd gotten excited about that as a pathway. But then, this term regenerative agriculture started getting more popular. And people started talking more specifically about the connection between climate and agriculture, which was something I cared deeply about, and the idea that, farms can reduce their emissions. And also potentially there's strategies where farmers can actually sequester carbon, store carbon in the soil and really be part of the climate solution. And so, I started researching this book because I was really curious about that prospect of carbon sequestration and, farms shifting agriculture from a climate problem to a climate solution. And one really key aspect of that conversation clearly was about grazing. And so I sought out Latrice because I understood that Latrice had a really unique perspective on this question of grazing. It had been introduced to me in the following way, that we can sort of look to native herbivores as a historical model to inform cattle grazing that is ecologically appropriate, because native herbivores co-evolved with the native vegetation on this continent. And so their patterns of grazing, where they would graze really heavy in an area and then move on and let it rest and selectively graze, you can learn from that to inform cattle production. But what was sort of missing from that was like the whole context of these native herbivores, the people that they were in relationships with? Why were they on those landscapes? And so I wanted to ask Latrice, who has this relationship with buffalo, with Ini, and who's been involved in bringing them back to their homelands, and who also manages cattle, about those connections, about regenerative grazing. And she really helped me see it on a much deeper level, I think, than what I had heard, prior to in writings about regenerative agriculture.
So I'm having this moment, and I say this full disclosure as someone with a PhD who has rejected the ivory tower, so I'm a little biased. But both of you are researchers and credentialed sort of academic folks. And I'm wondering if we could just pause before we get in and like talk about that in activism. Like, why is research important? How did Blackfeet Community College enable your inquiry, Latrice, and support you in continuing? Like, why? What role does academia and research play in this sort of in the broader framework of activism? Because I see that in both of your stories, and that's obviously the connection. But I want to talk about it because it's been coming up a lot. People are like, and then I took this class in college and it changed my life, or then I did this research project. So, like, how do you relate to that role?
I guess for me, it's not really, I don't, the term activism, for me, it's just more of knowing that I'm a part of the ecosystem. And as a being a part of the ecosystem, I have a responsibility to not only foster a relationship with the land, but to care for the land and to know well enough that, the land, like when the land is like almost like, if you have that connection, looking like, okay, this land's been grazed too hard, this land needs to rest. So it's like having that relationship connection. And, growing up, my dad and used to, when they were doing the Badger 2 medicine, and, they were trying to bring wells in to drill for oil. Well, I was in high school. And for me, like going in the mountains is like my church. For me, it's where I feel connected to the greater above me. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, to where I felt like the presence of, like, it was so pure in the mountains that not a lot has been touched by man. So you really feel the pureness of like real creation, of like being at its like natural point. And so having that and going with my father and being like finding sites of where our people were in these land or within these lands, and saying, like, having to find artifacts to be like, here's a teepee ring, here's like these various archaeological sites to prove that our people were there so they wouldn't develop oil there. For me, I wasn't doing it as activism. I was doing it because for me, it was my role to make sure those resources are protected for future generations. And so no matter what work I do with land, or whether I'm doing research, or whether I'm working with ranchers or working with student interns, it's all about making sure that, the greater good is, making sure we maintain and sustain like ecological systems for future generations down the road. And that's why I do the research I do, because I want to know, like, in 10 years, the changes we're making now, are they going to help? So that's, for me, that's what it's about.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is sometimes the sort of education and research process is just a means to the end, which is ultimately the protection and preservation of one's ancestor, the land, the resources. Liz, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's complex because a lot of these institutions have a pretty rough history. That High Country News piece about land grab universities doesn't pull any punches. Um, and so I think it's important to be eyes wide open about the limitations of these institutions and the moments in which we have to push against their kind of structural features and their histories, the directions they might sort of want to push us in. I'm really fortunate at UC Santa Barbara Environmental Studies to be surrounded by a number of colleagues who, like me, the way they think about their work is that they want to work in partnership with frontline communities wherever it is that they're connected. Some of my colleagues work with indigenous communities here on this continent. Some of my colleagues work in urban communities of color, but there's this kind of common value system of understanding the need to be humble coming from this position of coming from the university system, and that we don't know everything, that if we look at our track record, we haven't always helped solve problems. Sometimes we've contributed to them. And so, we need to kind of move forward in a spirit of humble inquiry and a partnership that really is mutual and reciprocal. If I didn't have colleagues who believe in working that way, I don't know that I would be able to do that kind of work myself. You sort of need to be surrounded by people that support you and understand you. But what I like about this environment with all of its challenges is that I think a classroom or a space that's designated as a space for learning is a place where we can set aside the rules of the road in the world as it is and imagine, just have a very expansive sense of possibility about the world that could be. And we can look to examples in other places and at other times in history, and we can look carefully at the processes that have created the world that we live in rather than just taking it for granted. And so that's what I really like about designating a space for learning, as checkered as this one with its colonial past is it's a place of possibility. It's a place where we can convene and come together and imagine a way of structuring our society that serves all of us better.
I think on another note too is, this in this country, we still have native cultures that are still really intact. And, and even though there are those relationships that are kind of tattered between, the education system and within, native communities, where we're at today, we understand that, we need to work together to ensure that we're, saving our resources, and not so much from the academia level, but, having our cultural knowledge utilized in ways that help make changes to the way that the land is utilized and managed is really important. Because, what I said before, I was like, before we never had a seat at the table, in the country that, our ancestors have been on from time immemorial, to where, we got to sit at the table, but we didn't get to talk. And, then we were at the table, we got to, say things here and there, but now we're at the table and we are expressing and sharing our own voices. And, we don't speak on behalf of our tribal nations. We speak on it based on our upbringing and our experiences as an individual, within our tribe. And so, when we look into that context, it's just really just wanting to be a resource to help bring the land identity back into, use our knowledge bases to really bring change, whether it's with research or whether it's, making policy changes, but knowing that our relationships with the land are so important and intact that, when we have our voice at the table and we're sharing these things, our voices will help change things for the better in the future.
Thanks for that. What's coming to mind for me is this place where I worked in grad school. I did my Ph.D. research there. It's a land restoration project led by Native Hawaiians, and they wanted to return what had been a monocropping rice production system back to the lo'i kalo or terraced kalo sort of wetlands. And so when the community gathered together to restore this land to food production, native food production, all of these native bird species returned. That and there was like 40 of this native duck on this land. I was there last weekend, which there's 300 in the world, and there's mamas and babies everywhere. And I did have that moment where I was like, in this story of regenerative agriculture and the story of regenerative practices, we're forgetting the people. As the Western colonial mind tends to, we divorce people from land. And what I heard in this story is that for you, Latrice, it is this relationship with land that drives you. And for you, Liz, realizing like we can't talk about high density rotational grazing without remembering that native landscapes also have people there, and that's just, it's fucking amazing to me that that's an aha moment. And yet it is for me again and again. It's like people belong on the land. But they belong on the land in a certain way. There's like an ethic to that. And so, Latrice, I'm wondering, like, what is the ethic? Like, how do we show up on the land with these beautiful herding animal species in ways that help those animals perform this amazing ecological function, which is actually to mitigate one of the biggest threats, I think, of our time, which is climate change.
For me, it's just understanding the relationship of the land. For me, it just brings me back to that, because when we look at the land as a teacher and we look at the animals as the elders, or vice versa, the land as the elder and the animals as the teacher, because in our culture, when we were evolving, as humans, we were struggling, in our origin, and we had the animals took pity on us and had to show us, how to live off the land and how to work together. And so, it's through that relationship. So for me, it's just carrying that on and relearning that and bringing it back to who we are as a people, because through residential schools and all that, we went through a time where it was like, forget your identity, forget who you are, blend, and now we're at such a beautiful phase of where I'm my children, I'm like, your Amskapi Pakani, where we live, there's teepee rings, there's buffalo jumps, everything Papa showed me that his parents or his grandparents, struggled with sharing because of that relationship with the boarding schools. And so, being able to share that freely and, having our own little small innie herd, that along on our cattle operation, my kids could say, we're going to, our buffalo got out the other day. So that's why I was kind of, so we were like getting the buffalo in, and my daughter was like, Mom, am I a real buffalo runner now? And I was like, you kind of really are, because you had to like follow them, to get them back in the crowd. I was like, yeah, you're a buffalo runner, so it's just really bringing that relationship back to the land, to the people, to understand we're not above it, we're below it, we're like a part of it. And our people were people of like medicine wheels and circles, and so everything within that is interconnected. We're all interconnected. And so when we're talking with Liz and stuff, I'm like, we're just casting these little pebbles, but a little pebble creates this ripple, and the other ripple creates another ripple, and pretty soon you have all these ripples. And and so for me, that's what my voice is right now. I'm throwing little pebbles and hoping, in the next 10 to 20 years, we're having this bigger ripple effect of, when my children are, doing, what they want to do and pursuing their joys and stuff in life, that, they're doing it in a way that they're tied back strongly or more to who they are as a, they're people, how I've had that growing up. So
Thanks for sharing that. I love the Buffalo Runner, the return of the Buffalo Runner.
yeah.
Liz, I'm wondering what came up for you when you heard that story. I saw your face react, and just sort of thinking as we wandered more towards sort of the exploration of the role of people in sort of the soil climate solution. Like, what have you learned in your research?
Yeah, I'm so glad you convened us today, Ashley, because I think sometimes people ask me like, well, what are you going to do next? Like the book is done, right? And it's not done, like I'm so glad I got to talk to Latrice the first time and the second time. But writing the book didn't make that conversation done. And every time I hear Latrice speak about these relationships, it's just so insightful. It just feels like this nourishment for me because I think it's not just in your head learning about, regenerative agriculture, this sort of paradigm shift. It's like a whole being transformation and it's a practice for me, and so what I keep, reflecting on is this idea of the land as teacher and the plants and the animals as elders. And I do think that's just such an important shift. Because when I look at, what's wrong with so much of agriculture on this continent, it is this idea that, step one, like go to the ecosystem. Step two, like kick the people off. Step three, like get rid of whatever life is already there, vegetation and animals, like blank canvas. And then step four, like impose the model that's you have for like an economically productive agriculture. And if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of agriculture in the United States looks like that and has that history. And that's so different from, saying to yourself, like, well, what is the land teaching? What are the plants and animals that are already there teaching? And what are the people who have been there since time immemorial teaching? And in a sense, like that's kind of all you really need to know about regenerative agriculture. And then everything after that is like really cool, fascinating details about, what species are regenerating when buffalo come home, or, all the cool details of, practicing regeneration in a place. But I think it is that shift to looking to these native plants and animals, and particularly these native people as the guides and the teachers. That's where it's at. That's really where it's at.
Latrice, you kind of like implied that we're in a shifting time. And I'm wondering, like, for me, when I too feel we are in a shifting time. And there's some like clarion moments when the shift, Standing Rock, I think for a lot of folks was like, we are seeing the rise of Native communities and a next generation of Native leaders reclaiming not just their seat at the table, but all the weapons they have at that table. And I think too, the battle for Mauna Kea here in Hawaii, and again, Kanaka Maoli, Native people saying, no, our sacred spaces aren't going to be used for astronomy research, as awesome as that is. But what are these other moments for you as a Native woman, as a thinker, as a researcher, as a land manager, as a land lover, that have helped you feel like we're in a new era?
For me, it's listening to the voices of the elders and, having them say, you guys are at a time of where they talk about the 7 generations, of, each generation coming back at that point and after, they're going to be the ones who are really bringing our voices back in and making those changes. Because, before like I said before, they took away that identity. And so, our elders are realizing like, hey, we gotta we got to put that identity back in our people. We got to put this in there because of our connection, and our identity is tied to the land. And so, it's really about bringing that back of who you are in that deep rooted connection, because the way I think of things, and when I'm like diving in, I think about it from a systems perspective of okay, if I manage the cows this way, or move my buffalo here, or have the horses here, what influence is that going to have, based on knowing what their behavior is. And so it's really knowing what the animals' relationships are to the land, what the land's relationship is to the plants, and taking into the consideration of like climate. And so it's really looking at it as a systems approach. And a part of that, we are part of the system. In the medicine wheel, it has, black, white, yellow, red, and that represents every person on earth, not just for our nation, but that makes up the Mother Earth. And so realizing the importance that we all play, not just as indigenous people, but as a whole, as the world, and knowing that yes, we have powers as an individual, but we also have power to influence others in a way that can help create and foster greater change. And so for me, that's where that relationship to land is really important, to knowing what I could do and how I could speak on it in a way that will help it for future generations, so that my kids and grandkids have the land and kept in a way that I did from when I grew, growing up on our ranch. So.
Liz, I'm curious what you see in terms of like seismic shifts that are happening in regenerative agriculture, and the sort of academic and scholarly and maybe social conversation that is returning Native folks to their rightful place in the conversation as co-producers with the land.
Yeah, I think that an extractive agriculture and an extractive way of relating to land, an extractive economy, an extractive society, it ultimately doesn't benefit life, any life. And so there are those who've been on the front lines of that extraction, who've understood this for a really long time, and whose whole ways of knowing teach that extraction is not the right thing to do, that we're all in relationship and we're all connected. And yet ultimately, I think all of us are harmed by those extractive ways of practicing agriculture and economy and social systems. And I think that with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with the degradation of soil, increasingly, I think that communities that previously thought they would not be harmed personally by extraction are feeling it too. And so, my whole career really started with talking to white settler farmers, most of whom were landowners, the kind of people that we think of as having a lot of privilege in agriculture, and people who, relatively speaking, do. And yet, finding themselves kind of at the end of the road, looking at bankruptcy, looking at losing their land. And so kind of hitting this wall of saying, maybe this way of doing agriculture is wrong. What do we do? And I think, wildfires in California have been another wake-up call that have hit people who previously were not personally impacted by these extractive economies. And so I think these ways in which people have been touched personally have maybe triggered some learning journeys. And, in California now, finally, the state government and academic institutions are looking at Native practices with fire and good fire, and consulting Indigenous people to inform management plans. And, of course, Indigenous communities have been demanding this for a really long time. and have been getting rejected, have gotten arrested for, their cultural practices of burning. But now the state is doing a 180 and saying, oh, wait, wow, like our whole state's going to burn up and people are going to lose their lives. Maybe we need to listen to these indigenous folks and their burning practices. So I think it's that way in which extraction is coming to touch all of our lives, that is leading to a lot of soul searching.
I hear the ghost and the spirit of Robin Wall Kimmer and braiding sweetgrass in this. For me, she was a really transformative. Again, for me, being a settler, haole, as we refer to foreigners here in Hawaii, is just a process of many aha moments of one's ignorance, and certainly I feel that one of the biggest gifts that being here on this land for 16 years has taught me is that so much of the solutions we seek are from older, wiser, and more gentler reciprocal relationships with our natural resources, and that we are all capable of having those relationships too. I know for me, a aha moment was like remembering that I too am a Native person, and that the land-based spiritual practices of my people were decimated by Catholicism and the burning of the witches, and yet I can look to those traditions to inform my own. Like you said, Latrice, that moment in the mountains, I was there with you. I was in the mountains in the presence of something so much greater, listening to Mother Earth. I've been there, and like that is truly where I find my center and my purpose, and just, I feel we're all capable of that.
Yes, we are.
So we've talked a little bit about all these reasons for hope. I mean, certainly there is a trending shift towards returning to Native knowledge and Native practices. And yet Native people, Native lands, resources protected by those communities have never been under greater threat. And I just want to acknowledge like so many front lines that continue to exist as people are fighting the last grasps of the fossil fuel industry, trying to get at every last little bit of fossil fuels. And that for me is a truth that causes me a lot of despair. And so I wanted to shift to that. I mean, as activists, thinkers, land managers, how do you grapple with that? Like the continued destruction of land that has been managed so gracefully by Native people for millennia?
For me, it comes from people not having a relationship with the land and knowing there's more value when it's intact than extracted, because, I feel like the colonial mindset is just take what you can take to, for the benefit of us, and when you come at it from a Native perspective, it's like take only what you need so that there's resources left. And so, those two viewpoints really separate. And so when they were trying to, do the oil leases and the badger to medicine, for me, that's where, this question really comes. Is the value of fossil fuel greater than the value of making sure I have clean drinking water? Is it more valuable than making sure the creeks that my children are swimming in are, is the value of fossil fuel greater than them making sure there's clean water for them to even play in? Because, where we're from, we have all those resources intact. But if they were to drill in those mountains of where we get our freshwater resources, then that will ultimately impact the quality of life that I and my children and generations to come will have. And so when you look at it that way, alternative resources are definitely the way to go. But then you look at that for batteries, you're also extracting. And so what I always tell ranchers, when it comes down to decision making, it really comes down to what you want to manage for. What are your goals? And that will help you make the decisions that you want to make based on what your goals are. And so, when we're looking at this alternative energy, we got to know we can't just be on this side or be on this side. It's really about finding a true balance. And I feel like as a people, with the way things are, we're either here or we're either there. We can't be both. But for me, as an indigenous woman, we always, from my cultural background, is we always harness what our balance is. And I think we forget that as a people, that we need to maintain our own balance, or whether it's our balance of our resources, balances our financial balances of our emotional, spiritual health. It really comes back to, what can we balance to make sure we're not just overtaking from one or undertaking. It's about finding what that balance is. And, as a whole, as an individual, I could say what I think, but as a whole country, we have to come to that together for it to be a greater change for, future generations to come.
Liz, I'm wondering what is giving you hope in this kind of moment of such despair?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question for somebody who teaches, these introductory classes in environmental studies. My students often walk in the first day and are like, please don't just bum us out for the whole quarter. We know it's bad out there, but, give us something to hang on to, of something we can do, to make things better. And it's been really transformative for me speaking with Latrice, who keeps sharing this word relationship in this conversation and in every conversation I've ever had with Latrice. And I think that has helped me to see that's the goal. When Latrice says, like, what goals are you managing for? As an environmental studies educator, that's what I'm managing for, is the restoration of relationships. And I understand that there are animals and plants and landscapes that have been harmed in the last few hundred years in ways that are never going to be fully repaired to what they looked like before that process. And we need to recognize that. We need to acknowledge that. We need to grieve that. We need to make that right in whatever ways we can for the people in relationship with those lands and for those beings and, the descendants that survive of those beings. And at the same time, I think we need to not despair that we can't recreate the world that existed 300 years ago in exactly the way it was. Because what I keep hearing Latrice talk about is restoring that relationship with land and the ability to go forward in a good way in right relationship with land. And that opportunity, in my mind, never goes away. I love the title of the book that a number of climate feminist women came together to create, called All We Can Save. And that was a part of their point, was to say that whatever it is that remains, of this beautiful planet, of this, Mother Earth that we call home, whatever it is that remains is worth, all of our effort and our love to care for. And it's as much, I think, about realizing our potential as human beings as it is about caring for those other beings. And when we do shift into that way of being reciprocal, we come into a better version of ourselves. I think the version of ourselves that we were meant to be, I see it in the students that I work with all the time, their first experience in a garden or a place that they've gone hiking, where they feel like, oh, this is who I was born to be. Like actually being human is awesome. I have a role here on this planet. Like, let's do it. And so to me, like, even if you don't get back, every species, that transformation in people is so important. And that is the work. And so since that's always possible, like, I'm never hopeless.
Yeah, I keep going back to Latrice up on the mountains looking for teepee rings and artifacts of presence of people, and knowing we live in this ironic moment where it is the presence of our ancestors that can protect our future ancestors, and that there is a divine speaking in that. And also just how important, like when we talk about experiential learning, what I hear is everything that all the care and love I hear, Latrice, when you say the word land. Like the way you say land is so potent because it sort of encapsulates something so much greater than like property. And knowing that transmission is what happens when we get people onto the earth with eyes, ears, and full senses intact.
For sure, that's part of what I do. Even when I was finishing my degree, I was like taking on some work. I was like, can we hire interns? I'll cut my salary so I can hire interns. So I like split my salary, and I was like, I could work for this to survive, just to make sure I get students out on the land, to work with ranchers. And, so for me, it's always about my opportunity to be able to give back in ways that I can get people back on the land, because growing up, that's what I seen my dad do. And he does it in a way that is more like him. And for me, I do it in a way that's more me, but research, but cultural science, So we talk about that all the time. He's like, we bring people back to the land, but your approach and my approach, they're different, but they're the same. And it's like, yeah, but my approach is because of the way that you taught me.
Ladies, we're almost out of time. And I've just this has flown by, and there's just so much richness in this. And we like to end with the question, like, what's one piece of advice you have for folks that are working to shift power and change or save the world that they live in? So Latrice, I'd love to start with you and then just pass it over to Liz.
For me, it's just going back to who we are as people, and knowing that who we are as people, we come from the land, and the land sustains us. And so, I'm not saying go and hug and kiss it, but just, have that respect, and knowing that, you couldn't go get food, or you couldn't go to the drive-through or anything without the land producing something that you need, whether it's your food, your clothes, your medicine, everything that we tie back to that we need as people comes back to the land. And so just knowing that, and just even honoring it in a way that being thankful for, like, oh, this computer, all this stuff was extracted, so like I could be on this Zoom call and knowing that, that's where it come from, so just having that deeper appreciation. So for that, to me, my last message is just the appreciation for the land.
Thanks, Latrice. Liz?
Yeah. And I'll just add something that Neil Thoughtbar shared with me. Neil is co-director of the Minnow Land Justice Project in California, which is featured in the last chapter of this book. And Neil got asked this question once when we were doing a conversation together. And he said, whatever you do, do it in community. these are really hard issues to try to face on your own. And it can be overwhelming. It can be existentially overwhelming. So I thought that was a great piece of advice. I've been passing it on to students because Neil is amazing. He's done a lot of incredible work. He's fought some uphill battles, and he's, sustained his sanity. And that was his advice, is just join a community of like-minded folks who are interested in the same work, and let them hold you, let them support you, let it not all be on your shoulders.
I love that. Well, I don't feel like it's all on my shoulders after meeting with both of you. So thank you so much. And we appreciate your time today.